At the age of 12, my parents made the decision to send me to live with my uncle in the countryside. They viewed me as a burden, preferring to focus their attention on my twin sister, who they believed had more potential. It was true that she was brighter than I was, and in a family filled with high achievers, being merely average felt like a failure. Both my parents were doctors, and they envisioned my sister and me following in their footsteps. However, my heart lay in creative pursuits rather than academic success. Despite my best efforts, my grades suffered, and my parents' constant comparisons to my sister stung like daggers. From a young age, this treatment took a toll on me, gradually eroding my confidence and making it difficult to focus. By middle school, my grades plummeted, and I was failing most of my classes. Teachers perceived me as lazy, unaware of the turmoil at home. Classmates often compared me to my exceptionally gifted sister, intensifying my feelings of inadequacy. Each night, I would cry myself to sleep while my parents lavished praise on her, reminding me of their disappointment in my perceived failures. One evening, after enduring harsh criticism about my grades at dinner, I snapped. My outburst led to a 2-week grounding, and in a fit of despair, I resolved to run away. Even though I had no plan, I barely made it to the nearby park, where I sat alone, trembling in the darkness. By 5 a.m., the police had found me, and I was brought back home. It was then that my parents decided to send me to my uncle's house. When they broke the news, I pleaded with them not to go through with it. I promised I would improve, that I would never disappoint them again or attempt to run away. But their minds were made up. They told me I had disappointed them one too many times and that they couldn't manage me any longer. They had another child to care for, one who wasn't useless like me. Most of their attention was devoted to my sister, who thrived under their praise while I remained in the shadows, subjected to ridicule for my academic struggles. I begged them not to separate me from my sister, the only person who treated me kindly, but my pleas fell on deaf ears. They forced me to say goodbye to her and wouldn't even let her accompany me to my uncle's home. Upon arriving at my uncle's, I was inconsolable for weeks. All I wanted was to go home. I attempted to reach out to my parents, but they ignored my calls. Although my uncle and aunt were supportive and understanding, the lack of communication from my parents only deepened my sense of isolation. Gradually, I resolved to accept my new reality. I maintained secret contact with my sister. She didn't have a cell phone, so I called her using my uncle's landline whenever my parents were out. As social media began to take off, she would occasionally use the computer to chat with me. When she assured me it was safe, I would call, and those conversations became my lifeline. My sister and I stay in touch regularly. Our love for each other has never wavered, and I know it never will. She keeps me informed about her life and what's happening with our parents. A couple of weeks ago, she mentioned that our parents were planning to reach out to me, which gave me time to mentally prepare for the possibility. It's been 10 long years since I last had contact with them. Initially, they refused to communicate after leaving me at my uncle's house. After a couple of years, I resolved not to reach out to them either. They had abandoned me, and I was done. Living with my uncle and aunt turned out to be a much better experience. They didn't pressure me the way my parents did, and I began to thrive in school. While I was still an average student, not the straight-A achiever my sister always was, I was at least passing my classes. My uncle and aunt encouraged me to participate in activities like school plays and sports, which my parents had prohibited, fearing they would interfere with my grades. I embraced life fully and was genuinely happy with them, unlike my parents, who forbade me from talking to boys because they thought it would be a distraction. My uncle and aunt had no such ridiculous rules. I was free to make friends and socialize, which is how I eventually met my husband, who has been a steadfast support in my life. We've been together for 6 years, starting our relationship in high school and continuing through college. I graduated last year, and just a week later, we got married. Last month, I welcomed our son into the world during an intimate ceremony. I no longer live with my uncle and aunt. My husband and I have our own home just a few streets away. We visit them often, especially now that they want to see their grandson. I'm currently on maternity leave, enjoying these precious weeks before I return to work. For the past few years, my sister and I have been open about our relationship. When she turned 18, she felt empowered to stop hiding our bond from our parents. She was my maid of honor at my wedding and is now the godmother of my child. Last week, during a visit, she told me our parents were planning to come see me. They had no idea I was married or that I had a baby since no one in the family spoke to them after they abandoned me. My sister chose not to keep them updated, even when they asked. After a decade, it seemed our parents were finally experiencing some regret and wanted to reconnect. My sister thought it was important to inform me so that I could decide how to respond and not be taken by surprise. A few days after her visit, my parents reached out via social media, asking if they could come visit. There was no apology in their message, just a straightforward request from both of them. I felt a wave of disappointment. I had expected at least an acknowledgement of their past actions. Anger flared up in me, and for a moment, I contemplated not responding at all. But then a better idea struck me. I decided to invite my parents over for dinner, intending to show them how well I was doing without them. I shared my address and asked them to come over that weekend. I also invited my uncle, aunt, and sister. Of course, as my husband and son would be there since we were hosting, I didn't mention to my uncle and aunt that my parents would be joining us, wanting to keep it a surprise. When they arrived last weekend, just 3 days ago, everyone was taken aback. The atmosphere was tense and awkward, as I hadn't seen my parents in 10 years, and the entire family had severed ties with them, including my uncle and aunt. My parents had once promised to support me financially, but it felt like a lifetime ago. While I lived with my uncle, my parents did send money every month, but they never bothered to keep in touch. It was clear they were just relieved to be rid of me. My uncle was upset about their emotional abandonment, but he didn't mind taking care of me. He stood up for me, telling the rest of the family what my parents had done, which ultimately led to everyone cutting ties with them. My dad continued to send money until I turned 18, after which there was no more contact. After we exchanged greetings, we were set to have dinner, but I decided to make a toast first. As if the atmosphere wasn't awkward enough, I wanted my parents to feel the weight of their actions and regret their choices. I stood up and began my speech, highlighting how wonderful the last 10 years had been in comparison to the first 12. I directed my words toward my uncle and aunt, acknowledging all they had done for me over the past decade. Honestly, I doubted I would have made it this far without their support. I also expressed my gratitude to my husband for standing by me through everything and to my sister for never giving up on me despite the challenges we faced. I intentionally left my parents out of my thanks because I had nothing to appreciate them for. They remained silent and downcast throughout my speech, clearly uncomfortable. After I finished, I decided to drive my point home further. I turned to my parents and announced that I was finally ready to introduce them to my new family. Their shock was palpable. My mother burst into tears and ran out. The whole situation felt incredibly dramatic and heavy. Once they left, the dinner that followed was filled with an awkward silence. No one stayed for dessert, and I was relieved, as the atmosphere felt too tense. While I didn't like my parents, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line. I hadn't had a chance to speak with my uncle and aunt yet, but my sister and husband both thought I had overstepped. They believed I should have ignored my parents' messages if I wasn't ready to interact with them and that insulting them was unnecessary. So now, I found myself questioning, am I the jerk for inviting my parents over for dinner and then humiliating them? Update 1. The comments have been mixed regarding whether I should apologize to my parents, but everyone agrees that I should reach out to my uncle and aunt. Since opinions about my parents were divided, I decided to contact my uncle today. It's been a week since the dinner, and we hadn't spoken much due to being busy and the lingering awkwardness. I called my uncle and immediately apologized for inviting my parents without giving him a heads up. He admitted he was shocked but eventually came to terms with it. He hadn't reached out earlier because he wasn't sure how I was feeling after that night. He agreed that the situation was awkward but assured me it was water under the bridge. I then called my aunt to apologize as well, and she had a similar response to my uncle. Now that I've expressed my apologies to both of them, I feel a weight lifted off my shoulders. However, I still don't believe I owe my parents an apology. After everything they put me through during my childhood, I doubt anyone would pity them for my behavior. They haven't apologized to me, so I don't see why I should apologize to them. I discussed this with my husband, who thought I should reach out to my parents. I explained that while my actions at dinner were uncalled for, my past experiences with them were equally unacceptable. He understood my perspective and didn't press the issue further. I shared the same thoughts with my sister. She was a bit skeptical but ultimately agreed that it was my choice. I was the one wronged, and she supported whatever decision I made. For the past week, my sister hasn't been able to reach our parents since they've been unusually quiet. I assume they're just laying low for now, but I expect them to reach out again, likely stirring up some drama. Update 2. I want to clarify that my sister isn't trying to play peacemaker by keeping a good relationship with our parents. Even if she is, I'm completely fine with it. Please don't make a big deal out of it in the comments. She knows what they did to me was wrong, but she was very young at the time and felt powerless to change things. She kept in touch with me, and that's what matters. She remains in contact with our parents because they're getting older, and she doesn't want to feel guilty for abandoning them. It's not as deep as some might think, so please refrain from accusing her of anything. We share a lot of love between us, and the negative comments directed at her are unwarranted. As I mentioned in my previous update, I was pretty sure my parents wouldn't take my actions lightly. They're not the type to let things go easily, so I anticipated some form of retaliation. Today, 10 days after the dinner, they went public with the incident on social media. This caught me off guard since they're not usually active online, but they chose to post about the situation. As expected, it was a one-sided narrative, focusing solely on how hurt they were without acknowledging their past actions. Honestly, I wouldn't have cared much about their post if it had only been directed at family members. No one in our family has a favorable opinion of my parents because of how they abandoned me. But they were clever. They tagged my coworkers and my husband's coworkers, even though he had nothing to do with the situation. My coworkers were completely unaware of my history with my parents, so they were shocked when they were tagged in the post. They started blowing up my phone almost immediately. Since I'm on maternity leave, I hadn't checked social media much, as I've been busy with my son. When I finally saw the messages and checked the post, I was taken aback and didn't know how to react. It dawned on me that my parents had likely stalked me online, finding my coworkers' accounts through pictures I had posted and tagged. They must have spent the past week digging into my life to try and ruin my reputation. After the initial shock wore off, I decided to comment and clarify the reality of the situation. I had nothing to hide. I was the victim here. While what happened at dinner was uncalled for, it wasn't unjustified. I typed out the entire story, detailing how my parents dropped me off at my uncle's house years ago and cut off all contact. Even when they recently reached out, they hadn't apologized. If they had, I might have reconsidered my words at dinner. I also clarified everything to my coworkers who had been tagged in my parents' post, apologizing on their behalf because they didn't deserve to be dragged into our family drama. It was ridiculous for my parents to involve them in this mess. I'm obviously very angry. My parents could have just targeted me, but dragging my coworkers into it felt low and unacceptable. I'm waiting for my husband to get home. I didn't want to bother him at work since he had an important client meeting. Otherwise, I might have reached out to him about this. Honestly, it's just petty drama. and I can handle it on my own. I've already spoken to my sister, and she thinks our parents are acting irrationally. They probably couldn't handle the disrespect and completely lost it. Still, nothing justifies their behavior. I haven't told my uncle or aunt because I know they'll have strong reactions, and I don't want to burden them since they're busy with work. Update 3. A few hours have passed since my last update. It's now 8 p.m. And everyone is at my house, my uncle, aunt, sister, and my husband, who's just returned from work. We're trying to figure out how to deal with this situation. I don't want to involve a lawyer, as some have suggested. I simply don't have the time or energy for a legal battle. I'd prefer to handle this personally and keep lawyers out of it for as long as possible. If my parents refuse to take down the post, I may have to consider contacting an attorney and exploring a defamation lawsuit or whatever is appropriate. For now, we're doing our best to persuade them to remove it. So far, we've all texted them, asking them to take it down, but they haven't responded or shown any concern. At least they haven't deleted my comment, so anyone who sees the post will also see the truth. Unfortunately, the post is gaining traction, which isn't good for me. It's not just my coworkers who have seen it. Some acquaintances are now reaching out to ask about it. I'm not sure how it showed up on their feeds, probably because I was tagged in the post, but I've removed the tag. And it's still visible. There must be a glitch in the app, but it's frustrating. People are bombarding me with questions, and I'm tired of explaining. They could just read my comment, but for some reason, they feel the need to reach out to me personally. It's becoming increasingly annoying. All I want is for this to blow over. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that HR doesn't contact me, as that could spell trouble. I really don't want my reputation at work to suffer because of my parents. Right now, my family and I are trying to figure out a way to get them to take the post down, but they're unresponsive. Tomorrow, my sister is planning to visit our parents to ask them to remove it in person. If they still refuse, we may have no choice but to involve a lawyer. I genuinely hope it doesn't come to that because it would create unnecessary complications. All I want is to spend time with my son during my maternity leave, not deal with their drama. Update 4. My sister visited our parents today for about an hour. She said they were very upset, which explains why they made that post and tagged my coworkers. As I suspected, they stalked me online to find my coworkers' social media accounts. It's creepy, but right now, it's the least of my concerns. She had a long discussion with them, and they stated they would take the post down if I apologized first. I told my sister that's a definite no from me because I didn't do anything wrong. Thankfully, she anticipated my response and made it clear to my parents that I wouldn't pretend to be sorry for something I didn't do. She warned them that if they didn't remove the post, we would have to involve a lawyer. After nearly an hour of discussion, my parents finally agreed to take it down. However, they told my sister to convey that they're cutting me out of their lives and inheritance. Honestly, I don't care about any of that. My priority was getting the post taken down. Their inheritance means nothing to me. My husband and I are doing well in our careers and are confident we're on the path to success. Even if we never become wealthy, I'm okay with that because I won't have to rely on my parents for financial support. My sister also made sure to communicate my feelings to them, so they understand where I stand. Now that this situation is resolved, I'm going to focus on enjoying the rest of my maternity leave with my son. I want to make the most of this precious time before I have to return to work. Thank you all so much for the support you've given me.